So the HDR wheels are one of the most powerful and advanced features inside DaVinci Resolve. They're also one of the most misunderstood. In this video, I'll be breaking down exactly how they work so you can start using them confidently in your color grading workflow. You'll learn why the HDR wheels are so powerful for adjusting things like your exposure, your white balance, and your contrast. Plus, I'll show you a hidden feature that helps you dial in perfect results every single time. I'll break this video up into two parts. First, I'll give you a tour of the HDR palette. I'll show you where the color wheels sit, where your zones graphs sit, and how to navigate between those additional tonal zones that you get within the HDR palette. Then we'll move into the advanced features, showing you things like why temperature adjustments in the HDR are more realistic versus your primary color wheels, why we can push contrast really far in the HDR without affecting our saturation. I'll show you what the black offset control is and why it's important. And then finally, we'll wrap it up by showing you how this entire tool allows us to put the Ansel Adams exposure method into practice inside DaVinci Resolve. Hey guys, JMO here. Welcome back to another tutorial. Let's get into it. If we're in our edit page, we can press Shift-6 to bring up the color page. And if we navigate down to HDR, this will bring us into the HDR high dynamic range color wheels. So the first thing you can see when you open up the HDR wheels are that we've already got more zones compared to our primary color wheels. In our primaries, we've got our lift, gamma, gain, and offset. In our HDR, we have black, dark, shadow, light, highlight, specular, and global. So we've got 7 different areas where we can control our footage. Now, already you can see we've got much more detailed control within the HDR palette. So let me just walk you through, give you a bit of a tour where everything is so you're familiar with it, and then I'll dive into the power of this tool. First up, we've got our black, our dark, our shadow, and our light control wheels. If I press any one of these gray circles, it'll reveal the rest of the tonal zones that we can use. So we can use light, highlight, and specular, and global as well. So this just allows us to quickly navigate between our tonal zones. You'll notice that as I move across, we've got 4 tonal zones. If I uncheck bank global with color wheels, what's going to happen now is the global color wheel is going to fix itself on the right hand side. So when I change between the tonal zones, the global wheel doesn't move. It's always available, which basically reduces our tonal zones down to 3 at a time. You know, generally you would make your global adjustments first, and then what you could do is you could bank it and then start getting into more granular control. Let's take our light color wheel here. So I'll just walk you through it quickly. We've got a 360-degree color wheel, so we can add in our hues, our colors, we can change things. Now this is obviously affecting the light part of the tonal zone. We've got our exposure here, increase the light exposure, and then we can increase our saturation. These are our angle and our strength. So if I go here, I can change our angle and our strength to X and Y. So now it changes to X and Y, which basically allows me to go on the X axis and then up and down the Y axis. Then I can change that to angle and strength. Then it'll change to the angle around the color wheel. I can adjust that, and then I can adjust the strength. Pretty much just doing the same thing, but just slightly different ways we can make adjustments. The other thing we can do is we can just grab the wheel in the middle and move it around. Now, one other thing, if I press Shift and just press a color or press anywhere in the wheel, I can actually just jump to that color. So that's pretty handy. So let's come down here. We've got temperature, we've got tint, hue, contrast, pivot, mid-tone detail, and black offset. So we'll get into all this in the second part of the video, but I'll just quickly show you where they are. This is the main part of our high dynamic range wheels. One thing we don't have in our primary color wheels are these zones. So we've got our high dynamic range zones graph, and now we can start getting into a more detailed view of specific tonal ranges within our image. If I look here on the left side, I've got my zones. I've got black, dark, shadow, light, highlight, specular. If you look at the arrow here on the black, you've got this little left arrow. It's pointing to the left. And then if I go up to the area that represents here, you can also see I've got a left arrow pointing to the left. So everything from this line to the left is going to be affected and named our black area. If I go to this one, I've got dark. So I've got the left arrow, I've got the left arrow. Anything to the left of this line will fall within our dark region. And then shadow, anything to the left of this line down to this direction will be in our shadow. If I go to light, you can see that our light actually starts within our shadow. So you've got these overlapping zones, which is one of the most powerful things about the HDR wheels. We can overlap different tonal zones to give us a nice smooth change between darks and lights in our scene. If I look, I've got the arrow pointing to the right. So this arrow pointing to the right, everything from this line to the right hand side will be represented by our light. Then we've got our highlights. Anything from the right of this line is highlight, and then anything to the right of this line is specular. Now we've got this 100 nits. So if we're editing in Rec 709, we'll cut off here. We won't have any specular highlights past this point because we're limited to 100 nit. But we're in a DaVinci wide gamut, so we've got the dynamic range. We can move our zone ranges, and you can see the max range is changing as I adjust it left and right. And then we've got fall off. This just allows us to smooth out the transition from where the point starts down into the darks and the blacks. So that's our fall off. And then if I go up here to the three dots, I can reset. So if I've made a bunch of changes, maybe color adjustments, I can reset them specifically, or I can reset the zones that I've defined if I just want to start and get back to the beginning, or I can reset all. I can also save a preset. So if I've made a specific set of tonal zones within the HDR palette, what I can do is, like, let's say, for example, I'm color grading some night footage and I've set up my tonal zones based on the night footage. I can save that as a preset. And then when I come back in the future to color grade anything at nighttime, I've got my, evening high dynamic range zones graph set up as a preset. That also works the same for, any outdoor shots. If I'm filming outdoor in sunlight, or if I'm filming indoors, I'll have these different zones. So you can just set up your presets. So it'll just save you time when you come back in the future. So we touched on display X and Y and display angle and strength. We already touched on bind global with color wheels. Here we've got our histograms. So I can turn them off. So you can see that the histogram disappears on and off. If you just, if it's getting in the road or you don't need it, you can turn it off. But I like to keep it on. And then we'll go down. We've got color space and gamma. Now, the HDR wheels are color space aware. So if you've set up your workflow correctly, you won't need to adjust these. I've got them use timeline because my timeline color space is DaVinci wide gamut. So it'll just know automatically that I'm in that color space. The only time you may need to adjust them is, for example, I'll give you a quick example of this. Let's say we've got our timeline set up here. We've got our CST in to DaVinci wide gamut, and then we've got our CST out to Rec 709. Now, I've done all my grading in between my CST in and out. However, I've got this LUT on the end. Let's say this is a finishing LUT and it's a LUT that was built in Rec 709. So I need to apply the finishing LUT after the CST out in the Rec 709 color space. And let's say I put the LUT on and I'm like, okay, I want to actually change a few things on the LUT. I want to make some adjustments in the HDR color wheels. These HDR color wheels are working in a DaVinci wide gamut color space because I've got them set to use timeline. If I start using these high dynamic range color wheels on this LUT in Rec 709, I'm going to start getting strange results. It's not going to work correctly because I've got this set up as use timeline. So this is the only time we would need to go in. There may be other times, but this is one example of when we would go into the color space. We'd set it to Rec 709. We'd change the gamma to gamma 2.2, which is what we've got set up here in our CST out. And now we can make changes on this LUT in the high dynamic range palette, knowing that the changes that we do make are going to be normal. So when we make adjustments to temperature and tint inside our HDR palette, we actually get more photometrically accurate results. So what that means is we get results similar to how the human eye perceives changes in the color temperature of the ambient light. Imagine you're in a studio or on a set and you change the lighting from cool to warm on the actual lighting inside the set or where you're filming, if we make a temperature tint adjustment in the HDR wheel, it's going to be much closer to actually changing the light physically on the set. So you get much more realistic changes in the color temperature, and it just looks a lot more natural and pleasing to the eye. You can compare your primary color wheel temperature and tint to your HDR temp and tint. So let me just show you what happens. So I brought up the CIE chromaticity graph here. Let me make a change on my primary color wheel. So I'm going to increase the temperature. So I'm going to pull it to the right. Now keep an eye on the graph and sort of see how it's moving. Pushes everything away through, and it's just come back around, and it's kind of done that. And I'll push everything to the left, and then I'll pull it back down. I'll make it cooler. Keep an eye on the graph, and also the image is also super blue. So that's what's happening there. You can see it moving back and forth. Now let's reset that and go to our HDR. Let's do the same thing on our HDR temp. So I'll pull it to the right. Now you can see, first of all, it's a lot more subtle in the movement. It's moving out to the right to there. It stops there. So that's as far as I can push it in terms of the Kelvin on the temperature in the HDR. Already you're kind of seeing it's a much more natural change. It's more subtle, it's a softer change, and it's not, you know, completely destroying the image. And I'll pull it to the left here on the cooler side. Now we can actually warm the image more than we can cool it in the high dynamic range color wheels. This is because we get more artifacting when we cool down the image versus when we heat it up. So we can push the warmth much more. And you can see the CIE graph, just how the response is a lot more subtle, more natural, and more pleasing. Let's compare our contrast adjustments between the primary color wheels and the HDR wheels. Let me go into my primaries here, and let's pull up our vector scope so we can actually see this represented on our vector. So remember, with our vector scope, if our colors are pushing out to the circle, to the edge, it's representing an increase in saturation. And if our colors move towards the center, it's representing a decrease in saturation. Let me increase contrast here on our primary color wheels. Now, if you keep an eye on the image and our vector scope, you can see that the oranges are pushing out to the edge and the blues are pushing out to the edge, representing an increase in saturation. And then if I look at the image, this increase in contrast is giving me a lot more saturation to the point where it looks completely mental. And then I'll just bring it down. Less contrast means less saturation to the point where the image disappears and there's no saturation or contrast. That's what happens when we adjust our contrast in our primary color wheels. Now let's go to our HDR wheels. Let's look at our contrast here on our HDR wheels and increase the contrast. Now, as I increase the contrast, the saturation on our vector scope, it's not really changing, not like it was on our primary color wheels. And again, if I pull it down to -0 contrast, you can still see we have saturation in our image. So this basically means that even when we're making large contrast adjustments in the HDR palette, our image saturation will remain perceptually the same to your eye, with small changes made to the actual saturation. So what you can do is, if you do make an increase or decrease in your contrast in the HDR palette, you can go into your global saturation and just increase it or decrease it if you do need to add a little bit extra or take a little bit away, depending on the look you're trying to achieve. So out of all the global controls, the black offset control is one of the most deceptively important. So let me show you how it works. So basically, the black offset lets you define where the darkest pixels sit on the image. Adjustments made to black offset do not offset the entire signal. They only affect the darkest portion of the signal. So it basically lets you set your black point with everything else moving around that point. So if I go to my black offset here and I start to increase it, keep an eye on the waveform, keep an eye on the shadows of the hair, you can see we're starting to get this pleasing flaring effect, basically a bit of a fade on the shadows. And you can see that's represented here by the waveform getting lifted and the black shadows getting lifted as well. Now that I've put my black offset there, any changes that I make let's go into the shadows and pull them down. You can see if I keep an eye on that black offset, it's staying around where I've set the black offset point. So I can reduce my shadows, but still maintain this lifted black offset. Then if I put them down, they're going to get darker, and lift them up, they're going to fade. I like using the black offset because it gives you a nice fade on the shadows and give you a nice cinematic look when you're adjusting it. And the other thing is you can actually make all your adjustments in your palette, and then maybe at the end you want to go in and tweak the black offset just to fine tune where it's sitting and, you know, finalize your image that way. So it's a really powerful feature and something that you should be aware of when you're using the HDR palette. So the Ansel Adams zone system divides images up into tonally specific regions based on the luminance. So you start here at pure black, and then you progressively go through the lighter shadows to 18% middle gray in the center midtones, and then up through progressively lighter highlights, and then right up to pure white. So if you haven't seen this before, this is the Ansel Adams zone system. And basically, it's meant to teach people how to think about using the available range of the photographic medium when exposing images. So the HDR palette lets you put this concept into practice by allowing you to make tonally specific color balance, saturation, and exposure adjustments that only affect the range of the shadows or the range of highlights that fell within that zone. So if I say, let's take my dark here and set it about there, okay? Now, I'm impacting the lower end of my image. So the lower end into the shadows and the dark regions. If I go back to my Ansel Adams, I'm going to be affecting anything here from like 3, 2, 1, and 0 within this area here. So that's kind of how the HDR zones graph reflects back to the Ansel Adams. And then on the other end, you've got your, let's say your light. So if I go here, this is my 18% middle gray, it's 0 stops. If I put it there, right in the middle, my light, I know that I'm affecting anything from the midtone here, right up to these areas in the highlights, and then white and pure white. So you can kind of see how this zone graph is reflected here by the Ansel Adams. So essentially you can jump in and make very, very specific adjustments to your darkest regions, to your brightest regions, anywhere in between, and then get that nice overlap so you're transitioning smoothly between different tonal regions. What I can do, if I press Shift and H, now what's going to happen is I'm going to see exactly which part of that tonal zone I'm affecting. So if I really just want to dial in the hair, I can press Shift and H, start moving things around. There's the fall off, so I've got more of that hair. If I pull that back, I'm getting more of the hair. And now I can see that I'm getting a nice selection across the hair here. So keep in mind that any adjustments I make to the blacks will be any part of the image to the left of this line, represented by this, Shift and H. Anything to the left of this line will be the darks. Anything to the left of this line will be the shadows. So you can define exactly where your tonal zones start and end. Now you can see there's a bit of an overlap here. So I've got light. So the arrow points to the right, which means anything to the right of this line is going to be in our light. Anything to the right of this line is our highlights. And then anything to the right of this line is our speculars. Again, I can move this back and forth to dial in exactly where that light tonal range begins and ends. Then I can also increase the fall off, get more of a smoother transition. And now when I go into my color wheels and start making exposure changes, I know exactly where I've got that tonal range set to, how much fall off, and can really start to dial in things like the skin tones and the mids on this image. Really powerful stuff. So now we've understood our range and our fall off. So that's our range, that's our fall off. If I stay on my shadow here and I go back to the color wheels, in my shadow, I've got my range, which is here, and then I've got my fall off, which is here. So these controls are just reflecting what's happening here. Range and fall off. So you can adjust your range and fall off directly on the color wheel, but just in case you're not sure what they were doing, it's this control here. And obviously each one has got its own range and its own fall off. Now we've got our mid-tone detail. So let's have a look at the face. And if I increase the mid-tone detail, you can start to see we're getting more perceived sharpness on the mid-tones. So anything around the face, anything in the mid-region of the graph. So we don't want to overdo it, but if we set it about there, you can see before and after, you get that nice detail boost. Now keep in mind, if you do make an adjustment on the mid-tone detail in the HDR wheels, it's going to be the same as your mid detail here in your color wheels. So you can see that's gone to 14 here. If I put that to 0 and go back, it's at 0. So they're the same control. Unlike your contrast and your pivot, your contrast and your pivot here are going to be different. And again, your temperature and your tint are going to be different in your color wheels versus your temperature and your tint in your HDR wheels. I'll have a PDF doc in the link in the description. So jump in, you can download it. I'll have this all mapped out as well. I've got a exposure mini course, so you can download that for free. Basically walking you through your primary color wheels, your primary log wheels, your lift, gamma, gain, your shadows, your mids, and your highlights. If you haven't really got a good understanding of that, it's worthwhile going through that, watching the videos and downloading those PDFs, because once you grasp the primary color wheels and the primary log wheels, then when you move on to the HDR wheels, it's just going to make so much more sense, and it'll really just benefit your color grading all over. Jump in, download them for free, and I will see you in the next video.